Hi, I'm Ben Landau-Taylor. I'm here with Michael Vassar, and we're going to talk about the Great Depression. It was a very interesting event which has been contested a lot in what it means. So, yeah, I want to kick us off.
Sure, okay. So I was basically aware a long time ago, after reading de Tocqueville, that the sort of narrative of approximately exponential consumption for the typical person at like more than 1%, maybe more than 2% a year, over the long term couldn't possibly be correct, because de Tocqueville is pretty good about giving incomes and education levels and consumption baskets for different classes of people in the America of the 1830s and comparing them to the consumption baskets in France. And it's just so completely crazy to, believe the basic industrial progress narrative in light of concrete specific consumption baskets and education and labor baskets from past societies.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed at some point that the life expectancy data in the US rose fastest during the Great Depression and second fastest during the 70s stagflation recession, which was also regarded as being a bad time,
Mm-hmm.
while rising not at all, basically, during the 50s and 60s, which are narratized as our greatest period of prosperity. And this made me think about whose depression and whose prosperity we're talking about. And I thought about how coming into the Great Depression and during the Great Depression, all of the people who were writing and talking about this were talking about overproduction, which sounds like prosperity, not like depression.
Yes.
And looking at consumption baskets in the Great Depression and life expectancies, it looked to me like, oh yeah, it seems like for the first time in human history, basically no one's really hungry, and a really large fraction of the population are consuming far more than they've ever consumed, but also the number of people who are zero marginal product workers has risen from about 5 or 10% to about 20 or 25%. And the rates of secure returns on capital have fallen by a factor of 3 or 4. So as a result, it seems like you have basically the trust fund kid types. The actually rich are going to stay fine both before and during the Great Depression. But the trust fund kid types whose parents were giving them the sort of capital that made them comfortable so that they can pursue a career in the arts and sciences, but mostly the literary arts, and who collectively come together to be the main storytellers of society, are falling from having an amount of capital that their parents used to expect to make them comfortable to having sort of poverty where they might not even be able to afford a maid and a cook. And so they're very depressed, and so they're looking for other people who are also doing worse, who can tell a story about how this is a big crisis for everyone, not just themselves.
And so, if I'm understanding correctly, the claim is that this is basically a relative transfer of resources from these elites who also end up being much of the sense-making apparatus broadly to the population at large in a way that raises many people's real living standards, especially as measured by life expectancy, while exploding a lot of the financial returns of the previous upper class.
Right. I mean, the transfer of resources is simply caused by abundance.
Mm-hmm.
For there to be abundance is for money to be less powerful. For everyone to be well fed is for the rich to no longer have the ability to rule with life or death threats over poor people while being experienced by those people as their benefactors rather than as their oppressors.
Mm-hmm. So you see, this is a period where money starts becoming less powerful, both in the sense of like, this is the end of when deflation is a thing that's happening a lot, and the beginning of the sort of unending tick of inflation as what's happening monetarily, and also just in terms of how much control does money, as opposed to other avenues of power, give you control over what's happening in the world?
Yeah, these are closely related, but yeah, I think that the Great Depression is when the power of money starts to fall precipitously, and once its power starts to fall, it's no longer able to hold on to power, and people who are more focused on political zero-sum games end up taking power.
And are the 70s and the 2008 crisis, are these the same trend being sort of ratcheted forward, or how do those relate to this transformation?
Yeah, I don't think they're really the same trend being ratcheted forward. As I noted, the 70s showed a increase in life expectancy. It is, like the Depression, remembered as a time of poverty that has an increase in life expectancy. So it does seem like there was a material abundance in the 60s that made it harder to hold power over people. It seems like there was a lot of motivation by the powers that be to cause people to have to get a haircut, get a real job, wear a suit, stop.
Yeah, if you tried to do the hippie secessionism, we're going to just go and live on our, compound in the middle of nowhere in the 1800s, like a bunch of people tried that in the 1800s and many of them just froze to death or whatever.
Right. You had to be competent to do hippie secessionism. There wasn't enough abundance to make it like a casual thing. So it seems like in the 70s there was to some degree a dissolution of safety and policing for the poor as partly a way of preserving some of money's value. Like if being poor means you're going to starve, you work really hard before the Depression. If being poor means you can live nicely in a compound with your friends, etc.
Yeah, it gets you out of the Mad Max zone as sort of the remaining threat being wielded to make people be economically productive.
I guess I don't think economic productivity is even relevant for the powerful. It primarily, powerful people are not seeking to make the people economically productive unless there's a war or some external enemy.
Yeah, so perhaps I should say financially productive.
Not that either. I think just powerless. Like, I think that the thing that's scary is that people might go away and then, like Muhammad, going to Medina and then regather their forces and come back. But but it seems like it was important for the establishment to, for instance, publicize the Manson murders in order to scare people out of hitchhiking. And it was important to the establishment to dismantle policing in poor areas and encourage racial hostilities, so that being poor and white was much more likely to get you or your kids killed. It seems like the 70s is the beginning of a norm in European societies of implementing state terror against poor whites in order to force most of the white population into implementing state terror against poor whites through asymmetrical or selective policing of minority populations in order to force most of the white population into a higher level of complicity and silence and ambition than would be natural to pursue if they weren't afraid of the consequences of not doing so.
And the claim is not that this was a consequence of the 70s depression, but that both of these are themselves a consequence of the same material abundance that preceded them.
Yeah. The Great Depression and the 70s depression both are material abundance, and that material abundance weakens the hold of power, and therefore creates a need to narratize some contraction, change of the system to stop producing that type of material abundance and reestablish power.
And do we see a similar thing with 2008, or is that a different pattern?
I think it's a very different pattern. I don't think that the aughts have seen rapid rising life expectancy. I don't think that So I don't think that the 2008 period has shown a drastic slowdown in the reported rate of GDP growth either, anything but. I mean, I think that the fundamental lie that was sold to the American public after the Great Depression was the idea that there's a price theory of value or an exchange theory of value, and simultaneously you can add up all of the value and find out how well people are doing. Actually, if there's a price theory of value, adding up all of the exchange value tells you how much power there is in society, not how much abundance or value there is in society.
Because the prices are measures of control over distribution, and when the TV costs a fifth less, it's still just as good to watch.
Right. Abundance looks like deflation almost necessarily, and deflation is the worst thing according to the story that they told afterwards. But
well, it's certainly the worst thing for the bankers.
Right. So GDP GDP with unlimited abundance, GDP is zero. And with unlimited scarcity, let's say there's enough food that 90% of the population is going to starve to death, the GDP goes to effectively infinite. People will borrow any amount in order to eat today.
Yes.
So at the extremes, lower GDP means people are doing better. And I think that analytically, it's also the case that throughout the continuum between the extremes, lower GDP means that people are doing better. GDP is just a measure of scarcity, not a measure of abundance at all. But we've been very effectively propagandized into assuming that measures of scarcity and therefore of the power that is wielded through money are measures of abundance.
And yet it does seem, if you look out over the world today, that GDP per capita correlates with abundance, not as well as the, pure orthodox version of the theory would predict, but they seem to mostly go together most of the time.
I'm not actually sure that that's true if you have made a very, very small number of controls. I think we can say that a history of communism is very bad for abundance and very bad for GDP. And being Africa is very bad for abundance and very bad for GDP. Having become communist or having never become agrarian and then industrialized both mean you'll have a really bad GDP. But that seems more like saying that losing wars, being colonized, is bad for your GDP than it is not the. So if you look at the country, it's a little bit confusing because of the role of exports in GDP.
Yes.
But if you look at the countries that have the most GDP growth, like Korea, you see this collapse of population is also the most extreme. And if you look at abundance, one of the things that we should have greatest certainty of for biological organism is that greater abundance will lead to more population growth, more reproduction, not less.
I mean, I am not sold on the idea that fertility tracks material abundance.
So I am completely sold on the idea that fertility at least tracks rate of change of material abundance. I think it's very plausible that peasants always had more kids than kings, because in order to be a good father as a king, you need to give your kids a kingdom each, which is expensive. And in order to be a good peasant father, you need to give their kids a cow each, which is cheap for a peasant compared to how expensive a kingdom is for a king. So that I think that increasing abundance will always increase the rate of reproduction.
So it seems like in South Korea there is increasing abundance of many things, and also the number of kids is falling like a rock.
I feel like it's very difficult to evaluate increasing or decreasing abundance of things in a context where there is also a change in the basket of goods, technological progress of various types of degradation of quality of goods, which doesn't get measured in the same way. You see what I mean?
Yeah, the question is always abundance of what exactly?
Like, I expect life expectancies have been rising in South Korea, and rapidly rising. And so that is indicative of abundance of some sort.
Yes.
And
also their educational system and the sort of extremely competitive approach to that suggests extreme scarcity of a different sort.
so I think I would say it suggests extreme scarcity of rights or secure position. Like, it suggests that the security of one's position as a member of the exploited classes is very poor, or the propaganda, the social pressure to feel like it would be very unsafe to be in the exploited classes is very strong. It feels like it seems like people are regarding it as existential to be part of the class who are receiving extracted wealth rather than part of the class from whom wealth is extracted.
So to bring this back to the Great Depression, if I recall correctly, in the US, at least during the Depression, like, there has been a general, quite gradual decline in American fertility for like centuries, basically, with only a brief spike after the baby boom. I don't think you would be able to see the Great Depression on like the graphs of US fertility. So it seems to have not impacted the sort of gradual slow decline happened at about the same rate as before and after.
Okay, that is not something I had checked, so good to have that information.
Yeah. So I'm kind of skeptical of I have not yet heard a theory of fertility which sounds persuasive to me, just because, you know, it's a complicated subject, and I have, you know, it's hard to get one that matches all of the data points we have, which is what makes me suspect that I have yet to hear the true theory of it.
I guess I feel like Ben Franklin's theory, which I remember picking up in passing, was pretty satisfying to me, which is that people will have as many children as they expect to be able to give a standard of living as great as or greater than their own.
Yeah, and then this was also David Ricardo's theory. And then sort of the black box in there is where do the expectations come from, which Ricardo is like, yeah, I'm just treating this as a black box. And
I mean, I think that the expectations come from one's own means of production, one's own means of economic participation. If your experience is that you can make money and live a comfortable life in XYZ manner, and you're not like totally confused about how you are actually making a living, which in our society most people are, but in Ben Franklin's society most people were not.
Right, because they were mostly just farmers, and they're like, oh yeah, that's where the corn comes from.
Right. So for a farmer, the expectation is going to be determined by the availability of land, the price of land, you know, mostly that. And
then if it's getting both more complex to track and also more precarious because of the changing social situation and perhaps like the increased difficulty of extraction for particular classes, that seems like it could impact it. Yeah.
Yes, it seems like in general, most of our problems, it seems to me, come from methods of collectively extracting value from others by confusing yourselves about whether you are helping people or hurting them, whether you are intentionally helping people or hurting them, ways of splitting people's awareness that make them much worse at hurting people, but much better at feeling indignant if people fight back, have ended up winning.
And so, like, just to concretize this, what's an example of this?
So broadly, the monotheism-polytheism divide seems like the divide here. So like, broadly speaking, Israel seems the best at hurting people per capita, and because they are not trying to be wrong about whether they are trying to hurt people when they are trying to hurt people.
Which lets them just be like, okay, we're going to win this war or whatever, rather than we're going to like do some sideways thing while pretending it's for your own good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But like, the British were maybe the historical all-time best at being able to hurt people for their own benefit, rather than just for their self-defense. Like, the Israelis seem to be able to hurt people in self-defense without qualms, but they don't seem to be able to hurt people for their own benefit without confusing themselves the way the British could.
And how does this map to monotheism and polytheism?
I mean, clearly Judaism and British-style Christianity are more monotheistic, while, say, India is usually kind of the most polytheistic of major nations. And, you know, you have, like, a caste system, which is all about, like, coercing people into providing services and, you know, filling a role in your life in a way that feels to both you and them like you are being spiritually better in a totally abstract way. You see what I'm saying? The knowing how to keep the hoi polloi down is what the word spiritual has always meant in every society that uses the term.
Mm-hmm.
Like, having a background concept of being that replaces your identity with a participation in a grand pattern of life whereby the higher classes oppress the lower classes and don't need to understand how they are taken care of. All they need to understand is how to be the right sort of person that gets taken care of. But that means they need a lot of reassurance in order to reproduce, because they don't understand how they survive. They don't understand how their kids are going to survive either. So they don't have enough kids to reproduce their populations.
Because it is, you know, apart from its effect on just the raw economics, increasing the confusion and so making it harder for people, even if they might be in a purely materially, adequate position, they might not understand that. Is that the idea here?
Yeah, in a sense, yes. I mean, I think that's the situation that the whole world, but especially America, is in right now. Like, we are in an unprecedentedly materially flourishing, prosperous, easy situation. We can easily produce a materially better standard of living for everyone than was available to anyone, basically, throughout all of human history.
Yes.
And
you still get people, who are like, oh, I don't know how I could ever raise a kid on only $400,000 a year. Is a real thing I heard from somebody.
Because they wouldn't make the $400,000 a year or even $40,000 a year. They wouldn't be employable and they wouldn't be able to defend their property in a court of law or through appeal to custom if they didn't confuse themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They would be a crazy person on the streets who can't hire a lawyer if they weren't confusing themselves.
Mm-hmm. And so, because the confusion ends up being a prerequisite for participation in the system, even when the people are materially secure, they don't perceive that.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you. This was a really interesting conversation, quite wide-ranging, touched on a bunch of things, many of which I think are worth going into in more depth, which I would love to do at some point.
Great. That was fun. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Cool. And it's perfect time to head out. So.
All right.